I'd like to introduce our guest today. He is a formidable human rights advocate and British filmmaker, as well as a newly popular news correspondent who became known to the world from his recent trip to the Gaza Strip. He provided footage and first-hand account from Operation Pillar of Cloud as the Israeli Defense Forces advanced on Palestine throughout the eight-day conflict. Although the current uprising has reached a ceasefire, this struggle continues unabated for more than 60 years, and our guest brings poignant insight from his time spent in the occupied territory. He is now on the second leg of his journey, sharing this testimony around the world, and we're grateful he's chosen to make stops across Canada on this enlightening speaking tour. Without further ado, please welcome Harry Fear.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for making this time. And let us begin by asking about your decision to visit Canada. What prompted you to choose our country to share your experiences, and what do you hope to accomplish here specifically?
Well, Canada, in a way, actually to an extent with regard to the Israel-Palestine conflict, can be actually lumped with the United States in the sense that North America, we can say, is responsible for very clearly supporting Israel, including in the most recent operation against Gaza, or aggression against Gaza, I would prefer to call it. And so, of course, within every society there are dissenters, well, in Canada and the United States, but actually even more in Canada, there is a lot of dissent on the topic of, this country, Canada's Harper, particularly his foreign policy with regard to Israel-Palestine conflict. And so I actually had a lot of requests from Canadians to come here and to give talks. So basically, I'm just saying yes to these people, actually. But at a structural level, I think it's very important to target the countries where the power lies. And really, Israel's power over the Palestinians is only existent because of North American and European power helping Israel, and particularly the United States, and in recent years because of Harper, Canada as well. Actually, it is really strategically advantageous to target the Israel-Palestine conflict in Canada and to give people here, best I can, an understanding and insight of how the Palestinians feel, generally speaking, the pain of the situation.
Okay. I understand you'll be making a number of stops that include Toronto, Hamilton, Guelph, London, Windsor, and Calgary, with the respective universities acting as host for your tour. Is there a website where interested parties can check the information, and are there additional venues that are yet to be determined?
Well, actually, yeah, people can go to gazareport.com and click on the World Talking Tour, and they can find all of the details. So I'll be speaking actually in the places that you said, but we're also thinking about, in the last couple of hours, extending the Canadian tour by a couple or a few days, actually, because, for example, we don't have some of the major cities in Canada here, and we're kind of being flooded with messages of people saying, "Why aren't you coming to my town?" and stuff like this. So actually, I may be staying a bit longer than expected, actually, but it's nice to be here.
That's nice to hear, and we're glad to have you.
Thank you.
So tell us about you personally. In one of your videos, it states you're from Oxfordshire, England. Where did you go to school, and what was your area of focus?
Well, yeah, I grew up as a kind of normal guy in Oxfordshire, England. I went to my local comprehensive and studied at a college in Oxford, studying basically politics, economics, and French. So this is kind of my background. I would say that intellectually, my mind is kind of on the one side, philosophically and politically orientated, and on the other side, maybe mathematically or they call it ICT in the UK, computers and technology and etc. These are kind of my two greatest brain areas, I guess we can say. So this is my background actually.
You're bringing them together well, I might add. What about your family? Are they supportive of your trips to Palestine, or do they worry about your safety?
I visited the West Bank in Israel first in 2010, And really, there was no reason particularly to be worried about me at this time. I managed to keep myself safe, actually. But having been to Gaza earlier last year in the summertime, um, it was dangerous, actually, to be honest with you, even at this time. And obviously, more recently, it was extremely dangerous because there was actually an 8-day war. So they have been extremely worried, really suffering actually from this worry, actually. But they are supportive and they are encouraging and they are actually amazing in this respect because it's not easy to ask your family to support such a mission, you know. So this is amazing actually to have this support. Thank God for this.
Okay. You've noted there are differences in the living conditions between the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Can you describe how they vary?
Yeah. Well, in Gaza, which is roughly comparable in size to Washington, D.C., there are 1.6 million Palestinians living in obviously a very densely populated area. And generally speaking, there are no Israeli troops inside Gaza. There is no ground occupation at all. It's under basically total Palestinian administration. And most Gazans are children. It's a very young population. Most of them are refugees from either 1948, 1967, 2008, or the most recent war. And generally, people are living in extreme poverty, actually. Most people rely on aid so that they don't starve to death. But it is a Palestinian land. It's a Palestinian entity with a Palestinian administration. So, in a way, these are the most obvious facts which are different from the West Bank. Because the West Bank, which is the other bit which is left of Palestine, which is actually far away from Gaza, is subject to a full-time military ground occupation. Gaza is subject to a full-time air and maritime occupation. That's not really in your face. In the West Bank, it's a ground occupation in your face. And so there is still extreme poverty in some places in the West Bank. The poverty is worse than in Gaza, actually. And the governance of the West Bank is much more messy and complicated because of this occupation. So the administration in the West Bank, many will say, is treasonous in respect that it collaborates with the Israeli occupation to an extent, and doesn't have the interests of the Palestinian people in hand at all. Um, if you're living in the West Bank, the fears and insecurity you face, and insecurity is the biggest thing that Palestinians face as a human rights violation. In the West Bank, your insecurity is the lack of freedom of movement because of the checkpoint system and the illegal settlements on Palestinian land, um, lack of access to water, for example, that is an insecurity. But also just having your family members arbitrarily arrested and imprisoned indefinitely, or actual violence on Israeli soldiers. Um, and Palestinians are killed in the West Bank. It's not just in Gaza that Palestinians are killed. But in Gaza, the threat is basically that you will be blown up, actually. There's no threat of being imprisoned or being humiliated at a checkpoint or not being able to get around. In Gaza, you know, there's no imprisonment program. Palestinians are just blown up. The ones that Israel doesn't like, it just assassinates them or tries to. In the West Bank, it's not the same. So there is a real difference, actually, in the insecurity, particularly that Palestinians face in both territories.
That's helpful to know. Thank you. And how far is the Gaza Strip from West Bank, and what separates these regions? Can Palestinians move freely from one part of their territory to the other?
Well, Israel was made in 1948 on top of what, you know, American and North American and European Christians, for example, call the Holy Land. And Israel exists on roughly so 75% of that land. And under international law, Palestinians have the right to about 25% of that homeland. So actually, the two bits of Palestine that are left are actually geographically non-contiguous. They are separated by Israel being basically plonked in the middle. So this is obviously a real problem, both in terms of freedom of movement that you allude to, and also political representation, actually. I mean, basically, there are two separated Palestinian entities to an extent, and this is severe, really. Also, having large Palestinian families, which is in the tradition and culture, um, this has an implication as well, because it means that families are split between the two territories. And is the freedom of movement situation between the two extremely limited, basically? If you're a Gazan citizen, the chance of you ever being able to go to East Jerusalem, which is on the other bit of Palestine, is basically 1 in 1,000. I mean, it just is extremely difficult to travel. There's some circumstances, if you're a Gazan, you may be able to go into Israel for medical treatment, but there are some horror stories even of that happening. For example, the husband of a friend of mine went for some kidney treatment in an Israeli hospital. He was a Gazan citizen, and he was imprisoned for throwing a stone when he was a child. He is now an adult. Uh,
Oh,
so even going into Israel actually poses its own risks. Going to the West Bank to see family, for example, if you're a Gazan, Palestinian in Gaza, is basically generally absolutely impossible, basically. So the freedom of movement between the two bits is basically, generally speaking, for the average person, zero, actually.
my goodness. And why is Gaza Strip called the world's largest open-air prison? Do you agree with this description?
Well, I'm a British citizen, and our current Prime Minister has said that it is the world's largest open-air prison. Actually, to an extent, I will agree with this. I mean, the Palestinians in Gaza, 1.6 million, are basically imprisoned in their own homeland, actually, in Gaza. This policy of blockade has been going on now for thousands of days. Palestinians are basically starved of normal economic life because there is extreme restriction on import and export in the territory. The land, sea, and air is controlled dominantly by Israel. And there's also extreme restriction on freedom of movement. So basically, Palestinians are generally imprisoned in their own land. Of course, there are nuances to this in the sense that some are able to leave for under some circumstances and etc. But if you're the average Gazan, you don't really have a hope in hell of actually starting a normal life somewhere else other than Gaza. You are basically imprisoned in Gaza, living an extremely suffocated life. And so this is why it's an open air prison. And I would go to say, actually, it's really a kind of prison playground, actually, because most of the children, most of the population are children, and they're suffering from this besiegement and occupation. So, really, it's a real tragedy, this illegal siege, and it's considered under international law illegal because it's essentially collective punishment, because it's treating the children of Gaza as if they're responsible for the actions of the adults, basically. And so Israel says it's a security blockade, but really it suffocates the lives of all, actually.
And many Canadians do not understand the structure of the Palestinian government. Can you explain how the West Bank and Gaza Strip each have different leadership and why it was Abbas who represented Palestine at the UN in her bid for observer status?
Okay, so in 2006, there was an election which was considered free and fair and proper, according to independent international auditors, including Jimmy Carter, his Carter Institute, I think it's called. They are an election observing body, and they said that this was all proper. Well, basically, Hamas won the election, and Abbas won the presidency. So Hamas basically should have constituted the majority power in the parliament, let's say, and Abbas should have become the president. The problem is that that basically didn't go down very well with particular Palestinian factions, and so there was a power war actually, and various coup attempts to try and change the outcome of the election. The point is that Hamas won the election, and actually Abbas won the presidency. And so this is why Mahmoud Abbas of the Fatah party, you will maybe have seen photographs of the yellow flags waving around bits of Palestine in recent days, because there have been various Fatah rallies, which is a separate discussion, but that's a good thing because it's an increase in political freedom of expression. So Abbas of Fatah is the president, basically, and the prime minister is Ismail Haniyeh. But the problem is that actually in the West Bank, they have brought around another prime minister. So actually, there are two prime ministers. And generally speaking, the Palestinians in Gaza would agree with this representation, which is that this additional prime minister in the West Bank is not legitimate because he did not actually win a mandate. And so there is a constant power struggle relationship, particularly Hamas and Fatah. And really, I mean, the obvious way to solve this is just to have an election again with agreed conditions, to have the whole parliament and everything refreshed. But there are various, of course, internal political reasons why this hasn't yet happened. But in Gaza, Hamas had a mandate in 2006 given to it, and so it has legitimacy, just as Abbas has legitimacy. And you talked about the bid to increase the status of Palestinian entity at the UN. Well, this was actually approved of as a move by Hamas, which was quite symbolic. Approval of the president doing that, doing something actually at all. And so that is good from the Palestinian point of view generally, because it means that we're seeing an increase in unity, and if you like, an increase in the fluidity of the Palestinian political system, actually, which has generally been pretty seized up as a result of the non-contiguity of the two bits of Palestine and various Israeli policies to try and weaken the Palestinian political representation.
Excellent, thank you. And what is the reaction amongst your Palestinian friends in regard to that success? What are they hoping observer status will accomplish?
Well, this is something because the increase in status ostensibly looks like a really great thing. Surely, after all of these decades, the world is treating us more like a country with rights enshrined in law and etc. Problem is that it might not necessarily work out for the best. And so I would say really it's about 50-50 actually, the Palestinians I talked to in Gaza, whether they supported the move or not. And I would just give a couple of reasons why it doesn't appear to be such a good thing. Number one, that this move was not taken with a referendum. It was not part of any election manifesto. So it is without a specific mandate. Which is obviously quite a big problem because it's talking about the status of the whole country recognized by the United Nations. It's quite a big deal, actually. So that would be one criticism. The other criticism would be that it solidifies the status quo with respect to Israel being a state and Palestine trying to be a state like Israel in the once Holy Land. And the problem with that is that some Palestinians would actually prefer to see a one-state solution rather than a two-state solution. What does that mean? It means that some Palestinians would rather see Israel and Palestine be one country rather than there being two countries. And the problem with the increase in status bid was that it ended up successfully seeking to codify Israel and Palestine as separate entities with distinct situations. And in many ways, practically, they're not distinct, actually. So these are some of the reasons why it could be bad. One specific detail is that in 1948, obviously, there was the creation of Israel, which Palestinians call a catastrophe, because they see that part of history as being basically the beginning of a policy of decades-long state terrorism, actually, that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forcibly driven from their own homes and villages. And so there are today millions of refugees from that incident around the world. And codifying the two-state solution would potentially risk the legal right. I mean, this is yet to be proven in law or in practice, but could potentially risk the legal right of those diasporic Palestinians, the refugees around the world, including in Canada, to go back to the Holy Land in some way, shape, or form. So that's one. Those are the specifics, actually, of why it could be banned. On the up hand, it's the 999th and most prominent affirmation by the world at the United Nations to say, well, look, the Palestinians are the underdog, actually, and they need to be recognized as human beings, and they have rights that are in our charter. And well, actually, they need to be given the status of normal people. So actually, this is positive in the sense it's part of a swelling and a tide and a momentum of sympathy and support for the Palestinians enshrined in law rights. So actually, this is a positive step. And this change in the status, which was successfully bidded for, comes just after the recent 8-day war, and I was there during the war. And therefore, it's quite significant because whenever there is a situation where Palestinians are seen to be oppressed, like during the war, the world is generally more ready to support the Palestinians because it becomes more and more obvious that what Israel's doing to Palestinians in the current situation is just unsustainable.
Okay. Now, Hamas is considered a terrorist organization by the Government of Canada. It seems the Western world shares this view and the Eastern world does not. So how does our interpretation of terrorism measure up in the streets of Gaza?
Well, this is very difficult, but we have to first really break down some kind of intellectual barriers, actually, and remember that really to call a group of people or people terrorists to other people, they are automatically seen as freedom fighters. Otherwise, these people wouldn't be existing, actually. I mean, in terms of the law, terrorism is using force to terrorize a population for an outcome, particularly a political outcome. So there is a scientific definition to terrorism, but the application of terrorism to Hamas is not really scientific. Actually, it's more political, because Hamas is a political movement. It's a widespread social movement, actually, still with an enormous amount of support today, and within it, it has, excuse me, a military wing, and so you could argue that its military wing is a terrorist organization, but calling the whole movement a terrorist organization is just not, accurate, basically. So you start to see that the employment of this idea of Hamas being a terrorist organization is not really scientific. It is a kind of propaganda notion to an extent. And Israel constantly bombards us with saying the Hamas terror organization, Hamas terror, and etc. And we have to be aware, actually, and many people don't know this, but the terror, so to speak, that Israel receives, particularly from example, rocket attacks over the border into Israel from Gaza, generally speaking, is not actually from Hamas. It's from totally other independent movements, their military wings in Gaza, particularly the Islamic Jihad movement, which has a different political policy to Hamas. It's another movement with its own military wing as well. So these groups are independent and ad hoc, and Israel tries to lump all of the terror together and say it's all Hamas's fault. Of course, actually, it's not really to an extent. I mean, obviously, Hamas is the government in Gaza, but it can't control everything the different people and groups do there, because there's lots of internal disputes and fights and problems. So actually, Hamas has not historically been really able to control the Islamic Jihad movement, for example. So that's very important to delineate. But also, we should really look at what the Palestinians think about these groups. You know, do they call them our terrorist groups? Well, no, they don't. I mean, 0.1% of 1% of 1% will. But generally speaking, these military wings of the different movements are considered to be resistance groups. And if we look at what happened during the 8-day war specifically as an example of this terrorism narrative, the Palestinians say, well, it's Israel, which is a state terrorist entity, It's not us that are the terrorists, it's Israel that's the terrorist. And that our groups are not really matched against the Israeli military, but are resisting it militarily the best they can. And specifically recently, there is an understanding that these resistance groups have been able to the Israeli military, repel Israeli military force, actually, to an extent. So they are seen as recently successful resistance groups, not terrorist groups.
Okay. And will you tell us what Hamas means and how they won the support of Gazans in a democratic election? What was their platform that really gained that support?
I think it's difficult for people to actually, generally speaking, understand. But Palestinians in Gaza, particularly, for example, are living under the most inhumane circumstances, imprisoned, oppressed, terrorized, refugeed inside their own homeland for decades. Most of the population are children. And when Israel uses internationally prohibited weapons like phosphorus, which burns your skin, in some cases to the bone, the Palestinians have an argument that this is state terrorism. And as the dynamic of the military dynamic between Israel and Palestinians is a kind of David and Goliath dynamic from the Palestinian point of view, the Palestinians will be, in my opinion, naturally driven to more what the mainstream in the West would call extreme positions towards not recognizing the legitimacy of Israel and etc. etc. And actually, to an extent, I think that this is basically psychologically and humanly understandable, really, because if you lose three family members in 8 days, and you know that the explanation is that an F-15 or an F-16 or a drone blew up, your cousin's home. Actually, you're not really going to appreciate that very much. And when you hear that it's been done by this, first world country that lives around the corner in your homeland, and that your brothers and sisters consider that to be their homeland, which has been stolen, you will see this Israel as not very pretty picture, actually. And so this is the image, and this is how Hamas ends up being considered by the West as representing extreme positions and etc. Now, Hamas ran on a Islamist platform. In other words, the morphing, if you like, or merging of political policy based in Islamic understanding of law. And so, for example, I mean, actually, in practice, there actually are not generally speaking Islamic punishments for criminal behavior, actually. But it's a conservative society, not enforced by law, but just enforced by tradition, if you like, in the population. But the point is that the political narratives are that we are Muslims, generally speaking, and that is the nature of the Palestinian people, and that we are being oppressed to an extent because we are Muslims. And to an extent, this is correct, because Israel uses Islamophobia as a rallying point. But the point is that Hamas ran on a political Islam basis, and made the Gaza Strip more conservative than it had been previously, to an extent sort of successfully, in the sense that they have been able to implement their vision to an extent, given a blockaded and economically suffocated situation. They have quite efficient governance, actually. I mean, for example, if you want to, as a humanitarian, volunteer in a Gazan hospital, you don't just walk in a white jacket. It's like a first world country in a sense that you have to go through all the hoops and the paperwork. So there is a real governance there. So that's Hamas, basically.
Okay. I understand that each political party has a militant wing, but Palestine has no army to defend itself. Essentially, they try to run a democracy, but since they're occupied by Israel, they are regulated according to Israel's military control. I'm also under the impression that Israel made it illegal for Palestinians to possess weapons, creating a disproportionate balance of power. Can you elaborate on this situation?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, there is a difference in those points between Gaza and the West Bank, actually. But let's take the armed uh, nature, the armed status. In the West Bank, basically, there is no armed resistance. I mean, I would not call throwing, children throwing stones armed resistance, particularly. This is, I mean, it's not non-violent, but it's not guns and etc. It's not, it's got some sort of military strategy to it. In Gaza, there is an armed resistance. That's what Palestinians call it, not violent resistance. They call it armed resistance. And actually, I should just add that under international law and UN resolutions, they do have a right to, in theory, armed resistance. Um, the point is that, as you say, Israel is actually an occupying power. And there was an election in 2006 which was subverted. The result of that was subverted because of Israeli domination and control. And so there have been coup attempts to overthrow Hamas's governance in Gaza, which were foiled, actually. But they were Israel US sponsored coup attempts. And so we're talking about the most powerful country on earth and Israel with the fourth most powerful military on earth trying to subvert the governance of a political party which is just 25 years old, with little infrastructure in a place the size of Washington, D.C., and they managed to actually see off this coup attempt. So this is seen as a miraculous success from the Palestinian point of view in defending their right to self-determination, actually. But as you say, the occupation and the status of Israel as an occupying power, both in the West Bank and Gaza, because Israel dominates Gaza in a different way to the West Bank, but it totally dominates Gaza still. It locked the prison door with the besiegement policy. Um, Israel has the responsibilities of an occupying power. And generally, in the most simple image, the problem is that Israel is occupying Palestinian land and is abrogating the Palestinians' right to determine their own future and their own lives and their own security. This is the most basic problem, actually, in essence. Um, so I'm not sure if I've answered your question, actually.
About the having no army to defend itself, but each party having a militant wing that I think quasi is might be said to be filling that need.
In a way, recently the groups have been working together. This is seen as a good thing generally from the Palestinian point of view, that there has been military unity and military coordination, for example, most recently during the war, when, as I said, Palestinians see that there was some sort of ability to see off Israeli force to an extent. The most recent war lasted 8 days and didn't see a ground invasion. The previous war of comparable tragedy was in 2008-9, over that winter period, which did see a 22-day operation and a ground invasion. So Palestinians see that that was sought off and cut off sooner because of successful armed resistance, actually. And for the first time in a long time, the different armed groups and every single political faction has an armed group. I mean, the top 4 or 5 ones that have any power or clout. And they all participated in armed resistance against Israel, all of the Palestinian parties. So that again underlines the fact that Israel should be talking to them. Yeah? It can't just call all of them terrorist groups, um, and therefore, unable to talk to them because they're terrorist groups. But they have acted in collaboration, which is seen as a good thing, as I say. And really, this resistance group narrative and these ad hoc military wings, they have basically come out of the history and culture of the Palestinian situation, which is that the conflict started in 1948 with absolute zero resistance to the Israeli army, which had tanks and aeroplanes and forcibly drove out, as I said, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from hundreds of villages and razed hundreds of these villages to the ground. Palestinians fled. I mean, they obviously could not survive against tanks, and at this time, even there were massacres of Palestinian civilians who posed zero resistance. Um, so out of this history comes a culture of really symbolic resistance. I mean, not any way military symmetrical or some sort of conventional war. Um, because Israel has 250 illegally acquired nuclear warheads, but symbolic resistance, generally speaking, and recently some manifest practical defense as well. So this is the slight change we can say in the nature of the resistance. Actually,
Okay.
it's clear. I'm not sure if it is, but
We're learning bit by bit. Now, some Canadians promote the narrative that Palestine is dropping bombs on Israel every day. They say the Jewish people live in constant fear and it's a daily fight for their survival against the Palestinians. Is this true from what you've seen firsthand?
to an extent, this is true in the sense that there are Israelis that live near the border with Gaza who suffer some sort of terrorism or threat of death or injury, etc., as a result of rocket fire from Gaza. But if you speak to the Israelis there who also look at the situation in Gaza, they will say, well, this is basically totally incomparable to the suffering of the Gazans who suffer from basically the daily threat of bombardment and death. And in the last 10 years, less than 200 Israelis have been killed through this means of rockets fired down onto these Israeli territories. Whereas in Gaza, thousands have been killed. So this is the difference. And really, it's a totally asymmetrical conflict. And one of the tragedies is that Israel as a state seems to be unwilling to actually ask the question, why are these rockets going into our territory? And they occasionally injure people, but generally speaking, they do really no human damage, and they sometimes do structural damage. If you look at the images of the incidents of damage in the Israeli territory. In some cases, it's severe, actually, but generally speaking, it's not severe. There are tiny little craters in the ground in sort of tennis courts and things like this, which cause no injury to people. And so there is a narrative in Gaza, which is that we know very well that our rockets are basically like fireworks and that they basically do no damage. But we know that they cause some risk to Israelis, and therefore they are really symbolic resistance rather than manifest military resistance. In other words, there's nothing else really we can do other than launch these DIY, homemade, with bits of metal and etc. Fireworks from Gaza into Israel. This is one of the narratives that explains the rockets situation. But it's very important to understand that the rockets being fired into Israel from the Palestinian narrative always fired in retaliation for something Israel has done. This is the explicit fact, which is very important to understand. And they are launched, generally speaking, clearly observable in that. In other words, a Palestinian gets killed, an innocent, under particular circumstances, and a rocket will be launched, and the press wing of that military wing will say, "We launched this rocket, and it did this damage, as far as we can tell, because Israel killed this person." This is the Palestinian narrative. So Palestinians say that their actions militarily are resistance and self-defense as well. So there is a cycle of violence because there is self-defense versus self-defense. But the thing is, it's not 50-50 because Israel basically is the dominant military power. Palestinians don't have an army. They don't have one tank. They don't have one airplane. The airport was bombed around by Israel 10 years ago. And so it's totally asymmetrical. So I hope that is clear.
Is it the same around for Israelis around the West Bank? Are they in the same type of danger?
Generally speaking, no. In the recent war, the Palestinian resistance groups were able to release military technology. Basically, I mean, it aggrandizes it. They basically came up with a new model of homemade rocket called the M75, which had a longer range than the other ones, which are basically don't really have a long range. Well, they're just not long range, they're medium and short range. But they released this long range model, which was able to strike even Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. So, generally speaking, no. Is the answer, because these rockets are not in the majority of those being launched, these long range ones, but there is the capacity to do so, to target and threaten those even as far as Jerusalem and Tel Aviv.
So it would be fair to say that the Palestinians in West Bank are not firing rockets at Israel the same as is coming out of Gaza.
Exactly. Basically, there is none of this in the West Bank. I mean, in terms of if you want to call stone throwing violent resistance, this is basically the only kind of non-violent resistance that exists in the West Bank, and most of the stone throwing is from either children or youth, actually. So in the West Bank, they have been using non-violence basically universally, non-violent resistance basically universally for decades now, and the world has basically ignored this. And Western liberals have said, "Oh, why don't the Palestinians use non-violent resistance and etc." And then when the Palestinians actually have done it, they've just ignored it. So this is the nature of the West Bank. In Gaza, there is also non-violent resistance, but remember, there are no Israelis there. So the demonstrations, which are peaceful and etc., are generally speaking internal symbolic demonstrations. For example, against the detaining of Palestinians in the thousands in the West Bank. With some Gazan citizens caught up in that as well. So there are, for example, weekly demonstrations, non-violent demonstrations in Gaza City, against the state of the prisoners, Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails.
Now, something you've said brought up another question for me. I'm under the impression that there may be hundreds of Palestinian children that have been imprisoned by Israel for throwing stones and perhaps even indefinitely. Can you explain?
Yeah, and in fact, this is for me symbolic, because this is one of the first issues that got me interested, if you like, in the plight of the Palestinians as a human rights issue, because actually it's on the historical record that Israel has tortured Palestinian children, including with electric torture, threatened rape, etc. So psychological as well as physical torture. And there are hundreds of Palestinian children in Israeli jails. And not only are they kept in adult conditions and in some cases tortured, and this is all, but I should have added, this is all objectively documented by bodies like Defence for Children International. This is not some sort of propaganda notion. This is even by Amnesty International documented. Um, these Palestinian prisoners, children, are largely, again, illegally taken into Israeli territory. In other words, the homeland of the occupying power. They're transferred, which is in breach of the Geneva Conventions, and so represents another breach of Palestinian human rights abuses and international law. So not only are they detained for, in some cases, as you say, throwing stones, but generally speaking, suspicion of throwing stones or alleged stone throwing and etc. They're then subjected to basically sort of arbitrary detention. In some cases, they can't see family, they don't have family visits. In some cases, they have even limited legal access. Very often, they're forced to work in the Hebrew language rather than with adequate Arabic translation. Palestinians speak Arabic, generally speaking. Some in the West Bank speak Hebrew, but the children, generally speaking, do not speak Hebrew well enough to defend themselves in a legal setting inside the Israeli military legal system. They are subjected to military law. So they basically don't have rights like Israelis would under the same circumstances. So there are extraordinary statistics of, for the same crime, an Israeli citizen can get 3 months in prison, and a Palestinian can get 20 years in prison for the same crime, just because they're subjected to a military law. And this military law is not only for criminal law, but also civil law and land. So Palestinians are subjected to a totally inhumane, biased legal system with regard to land ownership, which is something which facilitates the theft of Palestinian land and the colonizing of Palestinian land, basically, for example, by totally disregarding the Palestinian land ownership system. So, for example, let's say you, Amy, have the deed papers and ownership documents for a piece of land in the West Bank. Israel says, well, we just don't recognize the system, so we own it. Simple as this. So they are subject to this sort of inhumanity in terms of the legal treatment. Um, it's not just arbitrary detention and imprisonment, but it's also threat of detention and imprisonment. And being a full-time in-your-face ground operation, Israeli soldiers are responsible for extraordinary abuses of Palestinians in terms of humiliation, threatened abuse in the occupied Palestinian territory in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And there are, of course, Israeli soldiers who have broken their silence, blown the whistle, and testified to violate systematically the human rights of Palestinians, including children. This is on the historical and journalistic record, and people can Google, for example, "breaking silence Israeli soldiers testify" or something like this, and you just see the large amount of testimony. And there's been testimony also about the treatment of Gaza as well as the West Bank.
I believe they put out a book as well, and anyone would find that on Google.
And films as well, actually.
Drone attacks. This is a topic of great concern amongst human rights circles. Did they only happen during Operation Pillar of Cloud, or are the weapons used more frequently? And is there justification in the way Israel uses them to target Palestinians?
Well, for me, I feel personally, morally sensitive about drones because I think that having an unmanned aerial killing machine is probably not a very good idea in terms of the history of the human race and the direction of the human race, because it basically means that killing people becomes, psychologically speaking, for those actually pressing the red button on a PlayStation joystick, a sort of video game, but generally it becomes something which is far less accountable because there is basically no real risk involved for the occupying military power. So drones are automatically very problematic, I think. And obviously, the United States was responsible for pioneering drones as well as Israel. Israel is really the #1 pioneer of drone technology in the world, actually. And the UK even hires drones, from Israeli military companies. So you can see Israel, a tiny state halfway across the world, is helping out the big UK, who used to have an empire in which the sun never set, with their drone technology. So before the recent war, these drones flew over Gaza 365 days a year, 24 hours a day in numbers, surveilling and dropping bombs on people's homes and heads. And these drones are militarized. They are basically all of them are militarized. They're not just for surveillance. If you take, for example, the UK military, most of their drones are surveillance drones, and they have some militarized drones, a handful basically. Israel has many more, and they fly over Gaza in numbers. And they have been, before the recent war, responsible for a large amount, not most and not all, of violence inflicted on the Gaza Strip. But the drones are really particularly inhumane, actually, because they can fly over and hover at an altitude where they really are silent killers. So you're imprisoned in your own land, and you then even have no chance of running away from the bombs. So they pose a real symbolic tragedy in terms of this conflict. I've documented drone attacks on refugee camps in Gaza. People can Google, actually, drone hits were confirmed as one of the reports looking at drone attacks on Gaza that I made. During the recent war, drones were used, of course, in numbers as well, including for violence, for dropping bombs on people's heads. And most of the drones carry the word has evaded me, 2 bombs, let's say. And recently, since the recent war, drones have flown over Gaza, but under a much more limited basis, but they have incurred into Palestinian airspace. So this is the situation with drones.
Even during time of ceasefire.
Even during the time of the ceasefire.
And I think you have a story about a fellow at a university, near a university, was a victim of a drone attack.
Yes, actually. I mean, for example, when I was in Gaza for my first reporting mission, there was a real escalation in violence between Israel and the Palestinians. And during this summer period, there was the assassination of a young gentleman outside a university building. at prime time school leaving hour. And this gentleman was assassinated on his motorcycle, as I say, just outside this school entrance. And among the injured were students. And so this is the nature of the drone policy, that there is supposedly this targeting capability which is pinpoint, but it's not really used. This is the problem from the Palestinian point of view. So Israel is targeting what it is terrorists, which it has a legal right to do, but it's the way that it does it which is particularly problematic in the law because it's sort of discriminate and reckless, indiscriminate and reckless, and really is terrorizing Palestinians in Gaza.
Okay. On International Children's Day, Oxfam reported that Israel bombed two of its humanitarian kindergarten schools in the Gaza Strip. This isn't the first time, though, is it? And what does it take to rebuild when the peaceful infrastructure is destroyed?
Well, I mean, during the recent war and before, Israel has destroyed various buildings, including schools run and owned and built by the United Nations. In one case, in recent years, Israel razed to the ground a US school, an American school built in Gaza. In the recent war, Israel destroyed a school built and owned or whatever, sponsored by a Tunisian delegation. And then the Tunisian, I think it was foreign minister, if not prime minister, visited and gave a speech outside his school, which had been bombed by Israel. And so there is widespread affliction of Palestinian civilian infrastructure, including strategic infrastructure like schools and communication points, bridges, and etc., roads, etc., including hospitals as well. Actually, Palestinians in some cases will argue that Israel deliberately targets hospitals. And there's one incident of a hospital receiving an airstrike which caused severe damage to it in Gaza City during the recent 8-day war. So there is this kind of damage. In terms of rebuilding, one improvement in the situation in recent years is that there has been a real momentum towards reconstruction, and there has been an ability to reconstruct by subverting the blockade, by smuggling goods from Egypt underground into Gaza, particularly construction materials. And so there is some reconstruction which the government, Hamas, can do. Problem is that it can't do enough quickly enough. And so, excuse me, there is a total undersupply of reconstruction energy and effort. And so, for example, in one case, someone's home was partially destroyed, so it was unusable during Operation Cast Lead, Israel's escalation on Gaza in winter 2008. And someone's home was just rebuilt, although it was partially destroyed in the first week of that operation. It was just rebuilt last summer. Excuse me, is it last summer or the summer before now? I think it's last summer, summer 2012. So this shows you the delay in providing reconstruction, and most people, of course, cannot afford to reconstruct themselves, so they're relying on the government and aid agencies to help. So really, the aid and the reconstruction is really a stopgap solution excuse me, it's not a stopgap solution. Well, it is in the sense that it's a short to medium term solution to a long term political problem. The word has evaded me, but it's basically just putting a plaster on the wound.
And the delay in rebuilding, is that funds based, coming from the humanitarian orgs, or is it because of the blockade and the checkpoints and getting it through?
It's both. It's a lack of international provision. It's also a difficulty in getting the materials in, and then the conditions on which those construction efforts will be made. There have been improvements, and recently, for example, there was a Qatari deal to support Gaza with masses, millions of dollars worth of aid, which will help. However, there are some Gazans which will say, well, we've sold out to Qatar, and that the conditions placed on this aid are not in our interest, and look, we're becoming aid dependent and owned by other states and etc. So there is, of course, always problems with aid, which the Palestinians feel. And I'd like to say at this point that the Palestinians are not, stupid. They don't need to rely on aid. They're actually extremely resourceful, um, and of course capable, like human beings, if not more than the average human beings, at being resourceful and capable, and therefore being forced to be in this kind of aid dependent status is really a humiliation, actually. And in many cases, Gazans will say, well, we don't need this kind of international support. What we need is you to actually do something politically to get rid of the illegal siege and occupation. So there is a lot of strong sentiment to that narrative, actually. But the aid on a practical daily basis is essential to the maintenance of life in Gaza.
Okay. I've heard you speak passionately about the children. They suffer tremendously from military attacks, and it's widely acknowledged they're coping with PTSD. But after spending time in Gaza, I notice you correct that terminology with continuing stress disorder. Why is it continuing as opposed to post-traumatic, and can you describe the symptoms these kids are battling, their ages, and how many require the support of mental health services?
Well, this is a real tragedy, and I mean, I could talk about this for a long time. But basically, most of the population of Gaza suffer from traumatic stress and psychological disorders. And according to the Palestinian mental health institutions, etc., group centers, they say that all of the children suffer from psychological issues as a result of this. And let's take the children, because they're most of the population. Apparently, they all suffer. And it is, in some cases, post-traumatic, but in many cases, it's continuing. And I mean, the ceasefire has held in respect, since the recent 8-day war, in respect of airstrikes. It's generally acknowledged. So most of the violence is being stopped. Most of the normal violence has been stopped, but there is still a threat that this will come back. And so there is still continuing stress on people. And it's not just the stress of violence, but it's general insecurity, that they're refugees, impoverished refugees, unable to go back to their homeland, living in really absolute insecurity, including in food insecurity in some cases. And so really, it's just difficult for Westerners to imagine. Basically, every aspect of your life is totally insecure. And so this is the psychological driver. What does this mean? This means that there are widespread throughout the Palestinian society in Gaza, and including in West Bank, but particularly in Gaza, because of the nature of the violence there, serious, deep, profound, widespread psychological problems, insecurities, anxieties, psychological issues. And this affects everything from the social fabric to economic performance, to basic social cohesion, actually. I mean, if we take children, for example, this manifests in most children bedwetting or having, wet nightmares. It means that most children are constantly afraid of loud noises because they have grown up with bombs dropping around their home. People are afraid of their parents being lost. So there is extraordinary insecurity with children, what's the word actually? Having a separation insecurity from their parents, just basically not being able to leave the room from their parents, constantly wanting to be attached to their parents. I mean, this is just really tragic stories in Gaza. Obviously, inability for people to have normal social relationships because they're dealing with trauma, suffering, pain, insecurity, tragedy, and being internally refugeed in Gaza. Evacuating your home, having your home blown up, having your uncle's home blown up, having a cousin killed, knowing your other cousins imprisoned in the West Bank, knowing that your parents are refugees from their homeland and that you're living in a refugee camp, and that your grandfather still has the key to his home, which was your home 65 years ago. So really a kind of full spectrum insecurity, trauma, and suffering, which affects every part of the psychology. Um, and this means that there is a underperformance educationally, an underperformance economically, and means there are even cases of domestic violence as a result of men being unable to, for example, to provide for their families, and the general sort of humiliation and degradation of the social fabric and situation in Gaza. It really affects everyone, actually, generally speaking. So it's a real tragedy. So the occupation and the oppression eats Gazans not just externally, but internally.
Is Palestine able to keep up with the medical and psychosocial needs of its children?
Basically, no, because the problem is that how do you provide just to take the psychological support for most of 1.6 million Palestinians in Gaza? It's just not, you just can't do it. It's just not sustainable. There can't possibly be enough health centers, psychological centers to help. Um, and the problem is that not only is it a qualitative problem, but not only is it a quantitative problem, but it's also a qualitative problem. Because really, to an extent, how do you actually psychologically help people who are dealing with a full spectrum trauma and suffering? I mean, basically, it's actually kind of undoable. Um, you can't do it. So this is the problem. And so really, again, it comes back to the root, which is the conflict, and the conflict needs to be solved to solve these psychological problems. There are, of course, mental health programs which do invaluable work and work full out trying to do what they can. And there are psychological programs which are designed to go viral, actually, psychological techniques to deal with trauma which are designed to go viral within families and extended families, and therefore within society. In other words, they can be self trained, let's say, um, to deal with the psychological problem. So this is a source of hope. But I would say that our effort and our focus has to be on the driver of the psychological problem, not the solution primarily, because we have to find a sustainable resolution.
Excellent. And what is the employment and socio-economic situation of Gaza?
Yeah, exactly. With the social and economic situation, the point is that for the children, particularly, most of them are in school, but there is vast underprovision of schooling, and there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, of Gazan children who do not have the schooling which the government wishes to provide. So there is a real problem with educational provision under these circumstances. But with this question, the economic situation is that most people are unemployed. 75% plus of the youth is unemployed. And basically, you don't really have a hope in hell of getting a job, which makes the psychological situation even worse. And I alluded earlier to the psychological problems of men not being able to provide for their families, stuff like this. This is a real problem. So what this means is that in the large families, maybe one family member, one brother amongst a handful, will have a job, and he ends up providing for all of the family. And this is a real tragedy, actually, and really eats away at the social fabric really, of the society. So the social economic situation is that it's under extreme suffocation and burden as a result of the lack of import because of the blockade and the general insecurity and occupation. Just to give you a small example, for example, from the point of view of business, if you own a business which receives structural damage as a result of Israeli state terrorism, it's not covered by insurance. So this is obviously is not exactly conducive to commerce. So I mean, yeah, this is the nature of the economy in Gaza, extremely suffocated. There is also extreme inequality in the sense there are some millionaires and billionaires by Palestinian standards. But generally, most people are living in extreme poverty. The overwhelming majority of people live in extreme poverty.
And how is the occupation affecting Palestinian business, fishing, and agriculture?
Well, the business is really suffocated in the way I just described. But with fishing and agriculture, this is very much separate because the agriculture, I mean, most people are still are in such an impoverished state, and it's not a first world country; it's basically a third world entity, Gaza. That there is still a lot of reliance on self-subsistence living and agriculture, and 30% of the land which is prime for agriculture is actually caught up in the border with Israel. So it's highly insecure. And Gazans trying to farm in this land are subject to absolute insecurity, including live gunfire from Israeli forces along the border. Um, so the agricultural situation is problematic from a security point of view, as well as a resource point of view, because obviously water is a necessity. And water in Gaza is a serious problem again. The basic need to have water to survive in Gaza is another insecurity for people. Most people don't have proper access to water, and more than 90% of tap water supplies in Gaza, if there even are tap water supplies, most of the water in Gaza basically is of wholly unacceptable quality. It's basically like drinking away to illness to use it. And so, yeah, and it's really severe. And so this becomes another problem. So when there is agriculture in Gaza, basically the fruits and etc. are actually become toxic or poisoned foods. So what there is grown actually becomes doing damage as well as doing goodness. So that's another tragedy. As for the fishing, Palestinian fishermen trying to fish in Palestinian territorial waters are subjected to regular harassment and even violence. Palestinian fishermen have been killed fishing in their own territorial waters because the Israeli Navy occupies Palestinian territorial waters for security purposes. And so when I was in Gaza the first time, Palestinians were uh, shot at with live gunfire um, close to the shoreline from where I was going to say a stone's throw away, but not literally. But I mean, you could see the Israeli Navy vessel clearly from the shoreline and see the Palestinians suppressed and oppressed in their own waters. Um, and Palestinian fishermen have been killed, as I say, including around the time when I was there. And since the ceasefire, they've also been harassed, abducted, arrested, etc., had their equipment damaged. So Palestinian fishermen are doing not a job which is insecure because of dangerous fish, but a job which is insecure because of the Israeli occupation navy. And so there are about 3,500 Palestinian fishermen, and it's one of the only ways that these people can actually survive. Actually, it's one of the kind of desperate jobs. Actually, so there are people who have PhD degrees who end up becoming fishermen and then running the risk of injury and death, trying to provide for their families.
Daunting. Is Israel patrolling within the area that Palestine is supposed to have access to?
Maritime,
Pardon, sorry?
in the waters or the land?
Yes, in the waters.
Exactly. Palestinians have under international law territorial waters, which Israel occupies. And if I remember correctly, there was a military policy in place imposed by the Israeli Navy, which said that Palestinians have access to just the 3 mile from the coastline region. This was changed as a result of the recent ceasefire, improved incrementally to double to 6 nautical miles from the coastline. So supposedly, Palestinian fishermen could go out to up to 6 nautical miles from their coastline and fish. Problem is that from a fishing point of view, even 6 nautical miles isn't really enough, actually. And when this improvement was made, Palestinians were seeing fish coming out of the water that they had not seen in decades, actually. Fish which just were new to them because they're actually able to actually really access more of their own waters to fish. The problem is that these official Israeli policies and demarcations, 3 and 6 nautical miles, are not de facto because, for example, when the 3 nautical mile zone was in place as an allowed zone, anything beyond that you would be killed going in or out as a Palestinian. But even within the 3 nautical mile, Palestinians have been killed, including at the 1.5 nautical mile mark, which is 50% in from the supposed allowed zone by the Israeli Navy fishermen. So, in practice, it doesn't even work out as being what it says on the tin. And recently, as well, the same thing has happened with harassment and injury caused to Palestinian fishermen within the 6 nautical mile supposedly allowed zone. So, as you can see, this is not exactly a safe job to do, even in the sea, off the land.
Do they have recourse when that happens?
Basically, no. I mean, if you mean legal recourse, they have absolutely no legal recourse. In terms of resistance, well, they don't really stand a chance because of the gunboats and water cannons and etc. Um, they only really have a recourse as a kind of moral recourse in the sense that they have a kind of moral high ground in the sense that all they're trying to do is provide for their families in their own waters in their own homeland. And they obviously have international legal protection in theory, but not in practice. They have the right to be in their own waters and etc. And there are some international efforts, tiny ones, to go along as human rights observers and escorts, if you like, to to be eyewitnesses and support the Palestinians to try and defend them by internationals being there, because obviously Israel doesn't want to really end up with international blood on its hand. It's happy to kill Palestinians, but not internationals, because that would cause a political diplomatic problem. Um, so there are some efforts to do this, but in Gaza there are not many internationals actually. So this is a very small effort.
Is there access to higher education and ability to pay tuition and job prospects associated with a degree in Palestine?
There is excellent university provision um, if you can afford it, which obviously most can't, and even among the elite, most can't. And actually, the tuition fees are pretty extortionate, even by Western standard. They're actually comparable in absolute terms to UK tuition fees, which for a third world entity in a war zone, besieged and occupied, is not looking good for the population. But the quality of the education is actually excellent. And thankfully, there are academic links with international education institutions. So there are some good signs in this respect. And among those educating higher education, there is extraordinary academic excellence and determination to be academically excellent. And that's one of the reasons why we see some young some young Palestinians internationally in, for example, North America, because they represent the academic elite of the elite of the elite in Gaza and in West Bank, who are able to leave for academic purposes under these exceptional circumstances. So there is something to aspire to people, and obviously in some cases scholarships and etc. But for most people, as I said, they're living in absolute poverty.
You described fishermen might have a PhD, so does a degree really translate to work in one's field?
No, I mean, to an extent, if you have an engineering degree, you will end up as using that degree in the sense that in the UK, I think it's like 60% of graduates end up using their degree in a totally indirect and irrelevant way. Actually, it becomes sort of obsolete for them. It's just a piece of paper. In Gaza, it's not like that. That if you end up using your degree, it is specific, and there is a real drive to in the culture and tradition, academic tradition, to do hard subjects, engineering, maths, English, media, medicine, pharmacy, things which really can help the society, not luxury jobs, if you like, or niche jobs. But the problem is that there's vast under provision of employment opportunities, and so generally people end up doing kind of informal work, as you say, like the fishing, for example, totally unrelated from their education at all.
How do unemployed families eat? Has Israeli control of checkpoints hampered the flow of food to Palestinian territories?
Uh, well, okay. Well, the land situation and aid provision basically is through the land. And Gaza borders not only with Israel, actually, but also with Egypt. And the blockade of Gaza has basically been maintained by Egypt as well. particularly most obviously with the Mubarak regime just explicitly collaborating with Israel. And that collaboration has really not yet totally unwoven. So the Egyptian economic border with Gaza is basically still totally closed down. But some of the aid that goes into Gaza is through the Egyptian border, but most of the provision is through the Israeli border. And there is some aid which goes into Gaza, and there is some goods which go in. Problem is that it's not quantitatively or qualitatively adequate or appropriate. So a lot of the stuff that goes in, commercial stuff that goes in, separate from aid now, excuse me, is kind of not really actually useful, but it's the stuff which Israel lets in. There is a permitted list rather than a denied list. So there's a qualitative problem and also a quantitative problem that Israel doesn't let enough stuff in at all. And all of the international bodies like the United Nations say that. In terms of the aid is required to keep the Palestinians alive, most of them. And if that tap was turned off, you would see, basically a starving to death of most of the population. So that is really crucial and severe. So that's how most of the families live, is through aid, actually, and charity.
And what about in the West Bank? How are they getting their food goods in?
For the West Bank, it's a very different situation because although there is a lot of unemployment, there is a totally different economic situation in the sense that there is an economy in the West Bank in comparison to Gaza. And there is also employment opportunities for Palestinians in Israel if they can get work permits and etc. They often face humiliation and etc. and restrictions, but there are opportunities for employment in that sense. So it's a bit better in the West Bank, and there's more of an ability for families to provide for themselves than there is in Gaza.
You've noted different tactics of oppression from West Bank to the Gaza Strip. At the latter, it's predominantly violence, but in the West Bank, you often cite the use of humiliation. Can you explain that better? What exactly does humiliation mean?
Humiliation means being a pregnant woman and having to give birth to your baby at a checkpoint because an Israeli soldier simply arbitrarily decides that you're not going to be allowed to pass through the checkpoint and go to the hospital, and that you end up dying giving birth to your child because some 19-year-old soldier on military service just decided that it's not your lucky day. So that's humiliation. Humiliation is being a father and seeing your 10-year-old son arrested for doing nothing because he looks like another 10-year-old boy who threw a stone last night at an Israeli militarized vehicle inside Palestinian territory, not being able to do anything to help your children. That's the humiliation. The humiliation is trying to go to university in the West Bank to be a student, to attend lectures, for example, and it basically being a 15-minute car journey, but taking 5 hours because you have to go through 6 Israeli checkpoints where hundreds of Palestinians have to go through one turnstile and are subject to Israeli soldiers with M16 rifles, metal detectors, and etc. There's a whole policy of ID card systems of oppression, basically, for the Palestinians. So there is a real matrix of control of Palestinian life in the West Bank. And it's a real humiliation because there's, as you said, there is no armed resistance. There is basically nothing that they can really do other than make symbolic demonstrations in the West Bank, which have happened, as I say, for decades now and continue every day, actually, in the West Bank. It's really a kind of helpless situation in terms of practically. And so this is why it's a real humiliation. Whereas in Gaza, as I say, those sorts of oppression, that's forms of oppression, don't really exist. It's just violence, more generally speaking. I mean, of course, violence exists in the West Bank, but it's more, having the bottom of a rifle smacked around your face, or CS gas canister being launched into your home by Israeli occupation soldier, than a drone bomb being dropped on your neighbor's home. This is the difference.
I think in North America, there's a little bit of lacking understanding about checkpoints and what it's like in West Bank. And From what I gather, the checkpoints are mostly throughout the Palestinian territory, not just along the border. So going from one Palestinian town to another Palestinian town can take hours because it's still under Israeli control. And as well, that Israelis have different roads than the Palestinians do. They're not allowed to use them. They resemble North American roads, very well kept, but the Palestinians are forced to drive the country roads, and they have different colored license plates, from my understanding, to identify them for being stopped.
Exactly. And this brings up a key word, which I think that we might come to later. But the checkpoints are all over the Palestinian territory because Israel occupies all of the Palestinian territory in the West Bank. So with this military occupation comes military control with checkpoints. The checkpoints are everything from small football stadium-sized security entrance terminals. I mean, serious installations in Palestinian land, to just roadblocks with concrete and soldiers and etc. and everything in between. But it's not just checkpoints as well. Actually, it's also the provision of security for Israeli settlers in the West Bank at the expense of the security of Palestinians. So, for example, Israeli occupation soldiers in the West Bank will protect violent Israeli extremist settlers, fundamentalist, religious or ideologically fundamentalist settlers from attacking Palestinian children and do nothing to intervene. So this is another form of the humiliation and the security situation. Palestinians have a terrible security situation in the West Bank as well. And I would importantly add, it's not just from the Israeli occupation soldiers. In some cases, the Palestinian administration in the West Bank, which is seen as largely corrupt and treasonous in representation in some cases, actually exacts more violence, qualitatively, not quantitatively, but qualitatively, more violence on Palestinians than the Israeli soldiers do. And so that's one of the other dynamics of tragedy in the West Bank.
Interesting. I'll say one word and give you the floor. Apartheid.
So, apartheid. Well, we know apartheid because of the South African situation with the racial discrimination being based in law at the expense of non-white South Africans. And that finally was written out of law with the Stop Apartheid movement. So that's apartheid with a capital A. But following that, when that was resolved officially, there is now a crime of apartheid with a small a and a problem of apartheid with a small a, which is a system of legal discrimination based particularly on ethnicity, where one group is seen as exclusivist and superior at the expense of other groups practically and legally. And in the West Bank, you talked about and alluded to this with the apartheid road system. And even in Jerusalem, you have this as well. So, in other words, there are for Israelis and internationals under Israeli invitational visas. So basically, Jewish only roads plus internationals. This is basically what it means in Israel. Roads, which, as you say, are like Canadian highways, beautifully kept. In some cases, actually, I would say better than Canadian highways. Kept for Israeli settlers illegally occupying Palestinian territory. And the Palestinians, I mean, they don't even have country roads, Amy. They have tracks, which are basically not even roads, to travel around their own homeland because they don't have enough money to properly provide proper roads. And the Israeli occupation forces do not provide any sort of service to the Palestinian areas. In East Jerusalem, this is most striking, where the Israeli colonies, I should have just said clearly, Jerusalem, the east of it, is Palestinian territory according to the United Nations. The west of it is Israeli territory. So in East Jerusalem, Israel is illegally colonizing the area. So the parts that are colonies have, great provision. I mean, really splendid, North American standard. And the Palestinian areas which are left have zero, council. I mean, in the UK we call it local authority amenity provision, roads and etc. So it's striking to drive for 1 minute and suddenly be in what looks like a North American community, and then the next minute be back in the Middle East. Literally, when you're there, this is what it's like. In the Middle East, in an Arab, this is what the Israelis call Palestinians Arab, backyard, with waste everywhere and water butts on top of the buildings because there's no proper water provision, and the roads basically falling to pieces on the sides of hills. So this is what the apartheid looks like. But also, as I alluded to earlier, there's a whole system of discrimination for Palestinians in the law, with the military law, the land law, and also the ID card system. And there are really symbolic examples as well of apartheid, not just in the occupied territories which are being colonized, but also in Israel. So there is, for example, a law, and cases of this law being prosecuted, where if you are an Arab Israeli, a Palestinian Israeli, that is a Palestinian who ended up having Israeli citizenship, living in Israeli territory, and you, for example, have sexual relations with an Israeli Jewish citizen, if you were, for example, not to declare that you were a Palestinian, an Arab, this would be counted as rape. In other words, you not only just have to consent, mutual consent, you also have to basically give a kind of ethnic declaration. So you can see that this is really, to an extent, a profound racist and exclusivist problem, really apartheid, actually, in Israel and in the occupied territories.
Do you think Palestine will use its observer status to seek resolve through the UN about those issues?
I think with the crime of apartheid, it's less likely because there have been fewer cases of that crime being used to seek justice. But in other breaches of the Palestinian rights, I can see that it's more likely. For example, the settlements in the West Bank. This is why regularly condemned by the world, including mainstream politicians in the West. So I think this is a more likely target for legal redress by the Palestinian authorities, actually. And I believe and I hope that that will happen if Israel doesn't put blackmailing pressure on the Palestinians. And we know that Israel has blackmailed Palestinian authorities in the West Bank, even as well as in Gaza, to stop doing things which would help Palestinians under threat of violence or economic sanction.
Are there not a number of Israelis and Jewish people who want the occupation to end?
Yeah, within every system of oppression, there are dissenters, like there were in South Africa. And in Israel, there is a cohort of dissenters, and they take different forms from anti-occupation in the sense that the 1967 occupation, this is the two-state quality, which is that after the Six-Day War, Israel has been occupying, under international law, Palestinian territory. So Israel, if it withdrew and allowed Palestinians to determine their own future inside that territory under the law, this would form a two-state resolution to the conflict. I've just lost my train of thought. Yeah, there are some Israelis who support a two-state solution, who are against the occupation of the two-state. There are also some in the peace movement who are supportive of a one-state solution. In other words, break down the walls, get rid of the boundaries. We can live together in a secular democracy in peace if we just try hard and get rid of the racism. So there is also a cohort here as well. And I think that the Israeli dissenters are extremely brave, because they're dealing with a really indoctrinated domestic society, and a real military industrial complex, and a real war momentum. Israel is one of the most militarized countries in the world, not practically, but also ideologically. Let's just blow people up to sort the problem out. And so I think being a dissenter in this society is a real amazing thing, actually, But we have to make it clear that being an Israeli is not the same as being a Jewish person, because 20% of Israelis are not even Jewish. And in the world outside Israel, and most Jewish people do not live in Israel, outside of Israel, there are also Jewish dissenters as well, who say, well, actually, this hijacking of our Jewish identity is not something which we're going to accept being done in our name. And I think that really, given the history of the Jewish people, this also is an extremely profound and grave thing, actually. And it's amazing to see the collaboration between Jewish and Israeli peace groups and Palestinian peace groups, although that is increasingly limited because Israel tries to stop that collaboration from existing. But it's amazing to see that this dissent exists.
We've heard of rabbis for human rights. Are they very active in Israel?
Yes, they are one of the most active Israeli peace groups. Among the rabbis for human rights were the people that toured me or gave me guides around Israel. And they do extraordinary, conscientious work, putting their own freedom on the line, actually, breaking Israeli law, going into Palestine to observe and to support the Palestinians. So this, I think, is very brave and admirable, especially done in the name of the Jewish religion, which obviously the Jewish dissenters say that not just their religion, but their ethnic identity has been hijacked. So that really has an increased gravity. And these people are incredible, really.
And refuseniks, have you heard of them? Can you describe them?
Yeah, within the system of dissent is also people who say, well, actually, I'm not going to serve in the Israeli military and do my mandatory military service, which is for all of both genders, with the exception of not conscientious objectors, but religious, the Orthodox Jewish. Some of them, but the extreme Orthodox, if we can use this word, are exempted from military service, but otherwise everyone has to do it. And there are those, not many, but a few who say, well, I'm not going to do it, and then go to prison because they, for conscientious reasons, will not serve in the Israeli so-called defense forces.
And many in the Western culture struggle to understand the difference between a Zionist, an Israeli, and a Jewish person living in Israel. They think these terms are essentially refer to the same status. So are they right, or is this a myth?
Um, this is, I would say, not a myth, but a severe confusion. I mean, a Jewish person is, I'm not a Jew actually, so I'm not an expert on this, but academically speaking, I can speak on it with authority. A Jewish person is either religiously identified or ethnically identified, and so that is a Jew. Um, but Zionism has got nothing to do with religion or ethnic identification, actually, particularly explicitly. What do I mean by this? I mean that Zionism is a political ideology which says that we should make a state on top of Palestine called Israel, which we'll call the homeland of the Jewish people. So this is an ideological concept which is not religiously influenced, actually. And a litmus test for that that the Zionist political movement originally didn't choose the so-called Holy Land for the creation of Israel. It chose another island halfway across the world from Israel, totally not Holy Land. So that's that affirmation that it's not particularly religious. And many of the pioneering Zionists were actually the least religious among those adherents to Judaism, including some of the people, for example, symbolically did not circumcise their sons, for example. So that's the religious status. In terms of the ethnic status, most ethnic Jews don't live in Israel. So also it doesn't really fall strongly into this category, but it is a political movement. And therefore being against it is a of political nature, actually. And when you look at it from the Palestinian point of view, being an anti-Zionist, not necessarily all Palestinians are anti-Zionist, but to be an anti-Zionist would be against this political movement, which says it was acceptable and right for Israel to be made on top of Palestine. And as a human rights activist, you could say, well, stealing Palestinian land was a breach of their human rights, and therefore you could be an anti-Zionist human rights activist, for example, and this has got nothing to do with Judaism at all. So they are really not linked, actually. I mean, obviously, in this day and age, Israel makes sophisticated policy and propaganda out of trying to make everyone think that Israel has got everything to do with Judaism and Jewish identity. But actually, if you listen to the dissenting Jews and Israelis, they're not the same thing, they will say, well, actually, this isn't correct. And we're kind of having our Jewish history and identity hijacked. This is what the dissenters say. So that would be my answer to that.
I think Albert Einstein felt the same as a Jewish person. He did used to speak out and he'd write to the New York Times and whatnot in defense of the Jewish faith, and he was against Zionism himself.
Exactly.
So, what is the spirit of the Palestinian people and examples of their nonviolent resistance?
Well, the Palestinian spirit is kind of one of the things which makes us hopeful under this extraordinarily inhumane circumstance. Because the Palestinians, as I said before, have dealt with decades-long inhumanity and oppression outside of their control. But despite this, as I said, they are extraordinarily resourceful. But importantly, they have an amazing steadfastness, strength, motivation, momentum, hopefulness, openness to internationals and Jews included in that internationals, to keep going and to hope for a better future, a real faithfulness towards their plight and the cause of their people to get their self-determination and rights back. And this is one of the things which keeps us going, I think, as people who see the human rights abuses committed against the Palestinians, because the Palestinians will never give up and expect to get their rights back eventually, hopefully sooner rather than later, hopefully tomorrow, hopefully yesterday. But the Palestinian spirit is extraordinary, and having visited Gaza and the West Bank, particularly Gaza, because it's blockaded and starved of a lot of international solidarity and internationals, the people are really unimaginably hospitable. I mean, just unbelievable in their openness and lovingness towards people who they don't know. So this is really incredible, actually. And for me, it's a really motivating factor to keep trying to get the Palestinian understanding of history out to the world. Because for me, it's very clear that using unmanned aerial vehicles to blow up young men in Gaza is inhumane. And the general nature of the Palestinians in Gaza is humane under any humane circumstance. So this, to me, is a very symbolically motivating reality, the Palestinian spirit.
That's a really great thing to hear. Now, how are the ceasefires usually broken? Is there any pattern to the violence that peace negotiators and activists may wish to consider?
Well, the ceasefires are usually broken by Israel, but the Western media doesn't really tell anyone about this. So Israel gets to act with media impunity in this respect. So the pattern of violence generally is that Israel breaks the ceasefire, then there are rockets, and then Israel says, well, we're having to kill them more because of the rockets. But obviously the rockets are newer, they're younger than the Israeli occupation and oppression. The Israeli occupation outdates the rockets being used as a tactic. So this is, in a very simple litmus test, dissolvable as an argument in terms of when the clock started. And also targeting Hamas. Well, Hamas is just 25 years old. But according to international law, the Israeli occupation started in 1967. And according to Palestinians, generally speaking, their catastrophe was in 1948. So it's really where you choose to start the clock. So that's the pattern. And there is a cycle of violence, which is that when the rockets get launched into Israel, Israel says next time it breaks the ceasefire, excuse me, anytime it breaks the ceasefire, it says, "Oh, look, we were responding to those rockets from that week." But if we look at it specifically, generally the Palestinians actually adhere to the ceasefires, and it's not surprising because they're in a militarily hopeless situation, generally speaking. So of course they're going to accept and go along with the ceasefires, whereas the Israelis are basically um, Goliath in this dynamic. So they're obviously less likely to adhere to the ceasefires.
You were there, Harry. What event ignited the recent conflict? What was the starting point of the 8-day battle titled Operation Pillar of Cloud?
I was. And in fact, specifically speaking, I was hundreds of meters from one of the incidents which has to be written into history as igniting Operation Pillar of Cloud. Because 6 days before Israel launched this premeditated operation, Israeli force, military force, was responsible for the killing of a 13-year-old boy playing football outside of his home with his classmates in a context, in a situation where there was no Palestinian resistance or anything of the sort. The context was that Israeli tanks were incurring into Palestinian territory about 500 meters away from his home. And that me, myself, I was hundreds of meters away, and we heard the fire that killed 13-year-old Hamid Abu Daga, who was killed by some sort of Israeli shrapnel. So, from the Palestinian point of view, this is the lead up to Operation Pillar of Cloud. And Palestinian resistance groups explicitly retaliated, quote unquote, that's what they call it, for the killing of this innocent by firing rockets into Israel towards Israeli military bases, which actually, scientifically speaking, is not terrorism, actually, because they're targeting the military that was responsible for killing Hamid. So this is a specific example, doesn't fall into the technical narrative of terrorist groups. And this particular case, this is an interesting point. During that weekend, which followed the murder of Hamid or killing of Hamid, and the beginning of the Operation Pillar of Cloud, which was on a Wednesday, during this weekend, just before the Wednesday, Israel killed more Palestinian children. In a particular incident, it targeted an area near a funeral parade where two Palestinian children were killed, including a 15 and a 16-year-old. Um, and among those killed that weekend was a cousin of a friend of mine. And having spent even 12 weeks in Gaza, you start to realize that it becomes personal very quickly. And the families are large, and the tragedies are in every family and among all in Gaza, actually. I mean, during the war, a friend of mine was killed, actually. So this is the Palestinian understanding of how it started. Israel killed more Palestinian innocents. There was rocket retaliation, and then Israel used the retaliation as the explanation for why it launched its operation. However, actually, this really is not accurate because the operation was to an extent predicted actually by international political observers and regional observers who said, well, for various reasons, but including domestic Israeli political purposes, the Israeli military will launch another operation on Gaza to, different analysts explain it in different ways, but societally let out the frustration, if you like. I mean, some pseudo psychological analysis put it this way, but basically just let some Palestinian blood every once in a while. And so actually I did predict that this operation will occur at this time if it were to occur. Because of the alignment with the United States political situation, which will provide diplomatic and legal cover for Israel at the United Nations, and the Israeli domestic political situation with the Israeli elections as well.
At some point, the Israeli Defense Forces changed the name of their military operation from Pillar of Cloud to Pillar of Defense. Do you know why, and does this have any significance?
Well, again, I'm not an expert on Jewish culture or history, but according to my Jewish friends, they tell me that Operation Pillar of Cloud, this Pillar of Cloud, is a reference to a biblical story where the Jewish people were protected by a God-sent pillar of cloud. And so this is a biblical reference. The most obvious previous operation was Cast Lead, which really was another kind of psychopathic name. And I use this word quite critically, psychopathic, because Cast Lead, for example, was a reference to apparently a Jewish child's playground rhyme, playground story. Then they're using that name to then kill Palestinian children. I think that's psychopathic, actually, especially being a premeditated operation. So the name Pillar of Cloud is a translation, and it has another translation, which is Pillar of Defense. And obviously, it doesn't look very good for Israel to go around killing Palestinian children in the name of a biblical story. That's what it could be construed as. So actually, really, within hours, the official press releases from the Israeli side changed the name to Pillar of Defense, for fairly obvious reasons. Me, myself, I continue to use that original name because actually it's much more indicative of the nature of the operation than defense. I mean, just to give a little example for people listening or reading this, that it isn't a defensive or strategically defensive maneuver to kill 59 Palestinian in 8 days and then try and expect to get some sort of increased security from this, because Israel knows very well there are resistance groups which will retaliate for the killing of the children. And so it's obviously not defense, really, at all, actually. I mean, officially it is, but not really if you look at it seriously. So this is the name. The Western media generally were so slow to pick up the operation that they ended up generally catching the second name anyway. So it ended up being called Pillar of Defense pretty much universally.
Most governments take a hands-off approach to the battles, but can you describe the casualties between Israelis and Palestinians? What is happening as the world sits idly by?
Well, as I mentioned, during the 8-day operation, 59 Palestinian children were killed, including 17 babies. On the Israeli side, one Israeli infant, actually, I'm not sure if it was an infant, it was a child, was killed. During the 8-day war, about 179 Palestinians were killed, almost 180 Palestinians were killed, overwhelmingly civilians. Most of them were civilians, and among the civilians, most of those were women and children. On the Israeli side, 4 people were killed, 4 versus around 180. So this is actually not an aberration in the Israel-Palestine conflict. This is an extension of the historic dynamic of tragedy and casualty, because during Operation Cast Lead, the previous operation I keep comparing this one to, 13 Israelis were killed. Most of them were combatants from friendly fire. There were 3 Israelis killed through other situations. And among the Palestinians, there were over 1,400 killed, and most of those were civilians. So you've got hundreds of children killed in Cast Lead versus 3 Israeli civilians killed. And here you've got 1 Israeli child being killed, 59 Palestinian children. And if you account for the deaths in those days leading up to the beginning of the operation with Hamid and the other 2 children at that weekend I was talking about, that's 3 more. That's basically 62 Palestinian children killed in those weeks. So this really is true of the real dynamic of violence between Israel and the Palestinians. And then when you come to North America, as I've done, and then see what Harper supporting Israel explicitly, and Obama giving Israel military aid packages, it really hits home that in a way I'm in the lion's den, because this really is the part of the homeland of the oppression of the Palestinians, because it just wouldn't happen without this North American support and European support tagging along, poodling behind, as usual, the North American position.
Do you have any grand totals off the top of your head since 1967?
Actually, I do not have explicit grand totals, but as I said, there have been hundreds of Israelis killed, and there have been thousands of Israelis killed. But I will really affirm here a very important website for people to go to, and I really ask people to actually spend 20 seconds going to the website and sharing it through social media. If Americans knew, Google this, if Americans knew. It's a website dedicated just to the statistics of the Israel-Palestine conflict. The homepage has all of the bar graphs, which makes adequately clear who the aggressor and who the oppressed peoples are in the conflict, and it has the explicit numbers.
Helpful, thank you. What can we do to help from Canada? Are we powerless to sit at home and watch?
I would say absolutely not powerless, actually. I would say absolutely empowered to do something because we're talking about a first world country here where generally speaking, people are not living in poverty. They have leisure time in their lives, which they can donate at least a minute to a day to doing something for the Palestinians, for example. And politically speaking, they're living in a democracy, although a complicated democracy. If we look at the G20 riots, etc., and freedom of speech restrictions, and the way I was treated, immigration here coming to Canada, but that's another story. It is a democracy where new people can be elected. And so people obviously in Canada, I think, I mean, I haven't looked at the opinion polls, but having arrived, people are not exactly happy with Harper's administration here. People need to refresh the Canadian leadership and the Canadian political representation to take account for the foreign policy with regard to Israel and Palestine and make it an election point issue, if not on the platforms, the Canadian political platforms, then at least personally, so that people are not voting in the politicians that will support Israel and perpetuate this conflict. So that's really important. But also, people need to understand that we're living in a capitalist society here in North America, and that how we spend our money is probably more important than how we vote. And therefore, not spending money and giving money to the corporations and companies which are preoccupied with supporting Israel, if not in corporate messages, then actually just money economically and providing, for example, security to the colonies in Palestinian territory. Just yesterday, having been in Canada an hour, I saw the G4S security company providing security services for various shopping malls here and etc. This company, G4S, has adequate blood on its hands to boycott this company and to tell the company why it's not getting Canadian money. Because this company has been basically helping extremist Israeli settlers live in Palestinian land and then violently oppress Palestinians in their own homeland. So boycotting is really important, and ideally pushing for political representations of sanctions against Israel would also be an ideal as well. But the most important thing for people to do is, as I alluded to with the plea for people to share that website, if Americans knew, is to increase the awareness because it's all very well doing something yourself, but we have to make our family members do something, our extended family members do something, our colleagues, our community do something, and really make the thing snowball as a campaign issue, a human rights issue to support the Palestinians. So I would say actually in Canada, really, there's so much that Canadians can do, not least because there is a narrative in Canada, well, things have gone wrong since Harper was here, and that there aren't that many years to turn back time to make Canada the good guys again. It's not like that in the United States. So actually, I would say that there's much more fruit to be picked for Canadian people of conscience than American people of conscience, really.
It's funny, or I guess I should say troubling, that you brought up G4S because it does play into my next question, which is going to be if I told you the Canada Pension Plan, a government fund for our citizens' retirement, was invested in the Israeli occupation of Palestine, What would you say to our government and our people? And that is one of the companies.
Well, this is severe. Obviously, it has to be a political priority to get these companies outside um, of the system. I mean, the problem is being in North America, where it's kind of more overtly capitalistic than the UK, which is my home land, of course. Um, uh, you really feel this problem that life is run by the multinational corporations more than the government, basically, and that there is a capitalist momentum which has to be dealt with. And of course, the Occupy movements have been dealing with this in a very um, profound and impressive way, actually, I would argue. I mean, across the world, I'm not speaking about Canada particularly because I can't speak with authority about Occupy Canada. But one of the problems is trying to get out these multinational corporations, MNCs, from this kind of clout that they have, which is obviously a mammoth task, but has to be done. And really, I think targeting particular corporations, like you've alluded to here, is the way to go because you can't boycott all of the companies. I mean, you can if under extreme conditions, but it's very difficult to expect people to boycott all of the companies which are basically facilitating human rights abuses across the globe. It's very difficult. What you have to do is target the worst ones or the mediocrely complicit ones and scare all of the other ones home so that the other ones stop doing it as well. And if you look at the South African Stop Apartheid movement, they did this very well by specific targets of particular companies, boycotting them and scaring all of the other competition as well. This is, I think, really intelligent and strategically advantageous. So I would encourage people to do this. I mean, being part of the Canadian pension plan, this means that kind of most people end up with a small amount of blood on their hands. So this is actually a priority. I would say this is a political priority.
And I've got to do it because you brought it up, and I'll relate this in a two-part question. You said about our immigration and coming to visit. So, what was that like, and what kind of impression does Europe have of Canada since we've had Harper as a leader and our things have been changing? What kind of message will you take home?
Um, I will take home actually a hopeful message because I think that in Canada, people kind of know that this kind of right leaning or far right administration is not good. Whereas in the United States, I would say that people are largely unknowing that actually even Obama constitutes basically a de facto right leaning administration and is part of a long history of right leaning or explicitly right or far right um, representations. Whereas, as I mentioned earlier, I think that really there is at least an awareness here that, well, actually, it's Harper. It's Harper. We need to get rid of Harper, and we hope that the next guy isn't like this. And I think, in a way, from what I've heard, because I don't live here, but the things that Harper has got up to are so explicit and overt that it's easier to combat them at the next election and to turn back time 6 years, or was it 7 years now, than in the United States, for example, which has been on this sort of road for a longer time. So I will say that Canada are no longer the good guys like we used to say, but there's hope. I guess we can say this actually. The case with immigration. Um, I mean, it's perfectly respectful to have aggressive immigration authorities and etc. Um, and Canada actually, I think people generally are kind of affectionate about the Canadian immigration. That it's very aggressive, but they have a right to be enforceful about their borders. Um, for me, particularly though, I was honest, of course, at the immigration and why I was coming to Canada, and they were very interested in exactly what I would be saying in Canada, and exactly if anyone who I was supporting, who I was invited by. Do I have friends in Canada other than the people organising the tour and etc. And so even in some, in particularly during the investigation I had at immigration yesterday, do you advocate a position Do you support the Israelis? Do you support the Palestinians? Or do you try and be neutral? Which from, a guy sitting at a desk with, a standard, corporate Dell computer looking through my website asking me these questions is somewhat bizarre and really reminded me of the barring of British parliamentarian and Palestinian campaigner for Palestinian rights, George Galloway MP. He was barred by Harper's clowns from Canada, um, which to me is just bizarre. I mean, how this can be tolerated in what's supposedly a democracy. You don't like what the person says. And then for me to be asked basically what I'm saying falls in that framework of free speech intolerance. So that is, I think, not looking good, actually.
So that Canadians have a view of ourselves from the outside, how does that compare to your trips to other countries' immigration?
I mean, being a British passport holder, yesterday really was the first time ever of that not being a gold ticket slash wild card just to walk into someone's country indefinitely. Um, which even the people I was sitting next to on the plane told me, you got a British passport, but the Canadian authorities are still quite aggressive. It doesn't mean anything in Canada and stuff like this. I mean, in Europe, I have no problem. In Egypt, I have no problem. In Israel, of course, I will have a problem. Um, Israel is far more aggressive than Canada. They will not just do sort of intellectual or journalistic profiling. They will do religious, ethnic, socioeconomic profiling routinely, and they're even totally overt about it. When I flew back most recently from Israel, there was an Orthodox Jewish gentleman a couple of stops in front of me in the queue before he even checked in his baggage. And he was even having his Hebrew tested and his Jewish legal knowledge tested by the security officer standing in line at Tel Aviv International Airport. So I thought this was absolutely extraordinary and really actually even humiliating for even a British Jewish gentleman going for a bar mitzvah to see his relatives in Israel. This was quite shocking. So it's nothing in comparison to Israel in Canada.
And to give you an idea of what we are dealing with here, Stephen Harper represents the Conservative Party as our Prime Minister, and he is very on side with Israel. And so is the federal Liberal Party as well, also spoke in support of Israel, and they were very clear about that. So there are very few political options that are very sympathetic to the Palestinians, and we might have a lot of communication and education that we need to do here.
Amy, someone told me yesterday that one of the other front runners, let's say, perhaps a potential third party candidate, actually died of cancer, and that there was a lot of hope in him potentially winning, but ended up he just basically, unfortunately, died of cancer, which reduced the voting options in a way. I mean, in the UK, we have the similar situation, I guess, in the sense that the top two parties, the Conservatives who are in power now, and Labour, the principal opposition force today, they basically support Israel. The Liberal Democrats have a kind of soft empathy for the Palestinians, but kind of support Israel. Their Liberal Democrats, their party leader actually called for an arms embargo on Israel before he was in power. He's now in a coalition with the Conservatives, which is a bit curious, but anyway. And he obviously has totally forgotten about his commitments to the Palestinians, all of his policy promises on the Israel-Palestine conflict, and basically ended up also supporting Israel as well. So we also stuck hard as well in this respect.
Our official opposition is actually the NDP, and they seem to have changed places with the Liberals in being the other major party at the current time. And while they have been more open minded, they have not spoken adamantly about divestment and things of that nature.
Interesting.
So, in your talks, you encourage more human rights activists to get involved by visiting Gaza to document the abuses, because the violence and lockdown it's resulted in very few witnesses. You also describe a misconception about the safety of internationals, though. Would you care to explain this further? Is it safe to go?
Well, exactly. At the moment, there's a ceasefire in place, which means that there has not been obvious aerial bombardment of any of the Gaza Strip. And so actually it is safe for people to go at the moment, internationals to go. In many respects, from Israel, from the Israeli military point of view, being in Gaza, actually you're safer off in Gaza City than you are in Cairo right now because of the Egyptian repression and clashes and etc. And domestically as well, um, the police in Gaza provide a very high level of security and protection for internationals. I mean, they're treated like kind of royalty. I mean, exaggerating, but really, the government really is desperate to encourage internationals to go. So this is important. Um, but at the moment, it's safe for people to go. I will say explicitly, because it doesn't look like the ceasefire will be broken proper with airstrikes and another operation, etc. Because the Palestinians have not retaliated um, since the ceasefire has come into place, and Israel has killed more Palestinians. So since the ceasefire came into place towards the end of November, as a result of this Operation Pillar of Cloud, 2 Palestinians have been killed, including one which was shot in the mouth, a 20-year-old man. But the Palestinian groups have not resisted, retaliated, excuse me, yet for that, although they have, in some cases, threatened that they will if this continues. So at the moment, things are safe. And me, myself, actually, I'm taking a travel group of internationals in July next year. So if people who are listening want to come with my travel group, they can email me. The information is on my website. The subject should be convoy. But it is safe for people to go, actually, at the moment. And people need to go because Gaza is starved of, as you say, eyewitness attention, whereas the West Bank is comparatively not starved. Um, and so I really would encourage people to go and experience the amazing hospitality of Palestinians, and to be witnesses of what's going on. Yeah.
Again, about the nature of the people, I did notice something on your website where you got to meet the leader of Hamas. Would you like to recount that again?
Yeah, I got to meet the leader of Hamas and the Islamic Jihad movement, the so-called prime terrorist group in Gaza. And this was quite curious, actually, because having met, political leaders in the UK, in my work and etc., in my life, leaders generally are not humble people. Let's put it this way: they have a certain air of arrogance about them, and etc. and etc. And it was quite interesting to see that this arrogance didn't exist in these two leaders. And these are two serious Palestinian leaders in Palestinian society. They were not sort of arrogant in anything at all, making jokes during the interview and etc. It was quite interesting psychologically. And they were not sort of elite or kind of exclusivist. And when I interviewed, for example, the Islamic Jihad um, leader, um, sort of welcomed us into the place where we interviewed him, as if he was inviting us, for a tea break or something. It was all very odd, since it was very relaxed and kind of no significance. It felt, and meeting the leader of Hamas. As well, I think it was interesting, really. Hamas terror, Hamas terror, Hamas terrorist organization stuff. I mean, to me, it really was clear. This guy has been elected, and to the Palestinians, he is their prime minister. He's just a normal guy that's been elected. Um, this image was very vibrant, actually, and also the Islamic Jihad, which I mentioned earlier, was the most is the most active in what it was the most active in violent resistance against Israel, and again, terrorist leader and etc. The Islamic Jihad movement also has widespread popular support, and there's no there's not a massive differentiation made between those that are caught up in the resistance actually materially, actually being members of the resistance armed wings, and political, um, politically interested persons. It's not a big deal to the Palestinians that this guy's cousin is a member of the Islamic Jihad armed wing or this wing. It's just part of their history to have groups. So this whole terrorist thing is used in the West as a clear black and white demarcation, but it just isn't like that in Gaza. And having met these guys, that becomes even clearer.
Can you describe his house where he lives? You had made a comment about that I found quite interesting.
The leader of the Hamas movement, excuse me, the prime minister of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, he lives in the beach refugee camp, which is, basically 5 minutes drive from my home. And that refugee camp is one of the most impoverished places in Gaza. I mean, it is terrible place to live. I mean, it really is almost unimaginably terrible place to live. And he does not live in a mansion. He lives in a normal sized refugee house in a refugee camp. I mean, it has a level of armed protection outside his door and stuff, but basically he lives in normal conditions, which I think is symbolic of this arrogance versus humility thing. And Palestinians are very quick to say, well, look how humble our leaders are. In comparison to your Western so-called democracy, democratic leaders, which I find very interesting.
You're fond of saying that Palestine has the facts on her side. For those who aren't familiar with the record number of UN resolutions, can you describe why they matter?
Yeah, I think that there is a real basic information deficit. Not only is the Palestinian narrative not given any sort of 50-50% airtime, but the fact that Palestinians did not start the conflict basically does not really exist in terms of explanation and context. And so I say that the facts, basic facts, are on the Palestinian side. And in terms of the objective status from, for example, the United Nations, decades and decades have gone on. And the United Nations have said that what's happening to the Palestinians is unacceptable and it's against the law. And there are literally hundreds of UN resolutions that testify to that and affirm Palestinian rights. So these are the facts that I'm talking about. And they are overwhelmingly in the Palestinian, supporting the Palestinians. And this is the world. These are the states of the world making these resolutions.
To close our questions, I'm wondering if you'll share an important moment from your time in Palestine, a memory that really sticks with you and reminds you why you're doing this.
In a way, I have to give an example of something which is bad and something which is good. Because, as I said, the dynamic is that it's a terrible situation, but with extraordinary hope. I mean, during the recent war, I had to report, because I was reporting full time, the massacres that took place. And there was one example where the the Al-Dalu family, this is the jet lag and lack of food, which is going on here. The Al-Dalu family massacre, a handful of children and women killed, a family wiped off the map by the fourth greatest military in the world. With impunity, no real recourse to justice, and the Palestinians being hopeless and helpless, and having the Al-Dalu have all but one member killed by Israeli airstrike, a vacuum bomb, which wiped their home into a crater in central Gaza. I mean, for me, this just makes clear that what's going on is an emergency, it's wrong, and we've got to keep going. And the strength to keep going under these circumstances is, for me personally, because that's what you asked, inspired really largely by the Palestinians, who have extraordinary hope and faith that if we keep going, so to speak, we will get our land back and justice will prevail, actually. Justice will prevail. So this is widespread. This is almost universal. This hopefulness and this steadfastness and this faithful momentum for the Palestinian cause is what's really amazing, actually. And to see how family members deal with the tragedy of family members being killed, injured, imprisoned, unemployed, but to say we're Palestinian, we're used to this. We stay together as one unit and we deal with the pain together, and that we will prevail. these are not small words and small ideas.
Anything at all you'd like to add?
Well, thank you for listening because we've been talking for ages, and we've probably gone like 1 hour over time. Um, and yeah, well, thank you for this opportunity to talk to you. It's been a pleasure.
No, thank you, Harry. And for more information, or if you'd like to access Harry's works, you can find them at harryfear.co.uk. I'm Amy McPherson, and thanks for listening.